Okay.
Do you want to stand? No, I don't really want to stand. Oh, that's more, unless you really want.
You're even, no. That's good.
And yes, I look more the same size as everyone else if I'm sitting. So good afternoon, everyone. I do not have slides because Barry told us to not have slides so we could try to make this more interactive and fun, especially right after lunch. So I want to just give you all a little bit of highlights of what we're doing. You've heard a little bit this morning from some of the discussions, both from the Deputy Commissioner as well as Dr. Sheehan's remarks and from some of the other presenters about what we're doing. The patient preference side, but much more broadly, how are we partnering with patients and the science of patient input. So our 2016-2017 strategic priorities included partnering with patients, one, to maximize patient engagement and have our staff engage with patients. And as of the end of August, 85% of our staff have actually had patient engagement and have found it to be a meaningful activity. And then the other piece that's really probably the most relevant to this discussion is about the science of patient input and how do we incorporate that patient perspective in our regulatory decision making, and using that patient perspective both in terms of patient reported outcomes, and you saw the graph that Bill Murray had shown of the uptake and rise in patient reported outcomes, and as well as how do we incorporate patient preferences in our decision making. This of course started quite a few years ago with our benefit risk framework and the 2012 guidance that came out, where we sort of put the plug in to say that we were going to take patient perspectives into account in our benefit risk assessments, and then really launching into our patient preference initiative in 2013 with the workshop. I know some of the folks in the room have been involved with us from that very beginning to where we are now with the strategic priorities and our MDUFA 4 commitments, where we're going to really put a lot of emphasis on how do we incorporate that patient perspective, building a patient program, as well as developing our capacity and training for how we review patient reported outcomes and patient preferences. And on the patient reported outcomes side, we'll be looking at how to develop a flexible framework for patient reported outcomes, understanding that the 2009 guidance may have been a bit too rigid for some instances of using patient reported outcomes, and also looking at bridging studies. So how can we bridge currently existing patient reported outcomes that are used in a certain context, but then bridge it to some other contexts, for example, taking a PRO that's already used in adults and bridging it to pediatrics, where there might be a question that's currently in the PRO that says, oh, well, were you able to go to work today? Probably not so relevant for a kid. So, but we don't need to start from scratch and throw the baby out with the bathwater for the PROs. Just make a few edits here and there and try to work on that. And also really being clear that both patient preferences and patient reported outcomes are voluntary, and it's really depending on the context of what we're doing. And this is where partnerships like MDIC can really come into play, that we can continue to adapt the science and continue to work as we work through the different methodologies for how to use patient preferences and patient reported outcomes. And certainly on the patient preference side, we really did a lot of work first with the obesity study in 2000, when was it published? I'm going to make up a year, so I'm not going to say the year. 14? So that was really our first proof of concept of how to use patient preferences in regulatory decision making, and Kim talked about that a bit this morning on the panel. And then really from there, and that's sort of the gold standard kind of DCE, Rolls-Royce type of patient preference study, and we're also really looking at all the other different methodologies and how can we incorporate that patient input, and it's really going to depend on the context of what you're trying to do. So we've seen just recently, and Deputy Commissioner Abrams talked about this morning, the next stage approval where we expanded the indication to solo home hemodialysis without a care partner, in part based on the patient preference study. And that was a different method that was in the MDIC catalog, so that you don't always need to do a DCE, you don't always have to do this method or that method. It's really going to depend on what it is you're going to try to do. And then we also talked about in our FDA Voice blog last week that many of you may have seen, in the case with diabetes, we had approved an insulin pump and glucose meter working together in pediatric patients. And through some qualitative, not even a survey, but qualitative patient preference information from patients, from parents saying that they were concerned about a safety risk about the potential boluses, with kids playing with the pump. And in that situation, we'd already approved the device. We decided that the benefits, we already made a benefit risk assessment that the benefits outweigh the risk, and working with the company, just based on that qualitative information, was really enough for the company to add a lockout feature to the device. So it just shows that the different types of input and the different types of patient preferences are really going to depend on what questions you're trying to answer. And we look forward to further discussing. And is that enough?
All right, great. Thank you, Annie. Appreciate it. All right, so what we're going to do is go down the line here, and we're going to start at the far end. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to, I just probably mispronounced everybody's name, so correct me on on the right pronunciation, and tell us a little bit about your organization and why it is that you or your organization thinks that patient input matters. So.
Certainly. I think you were actually spot on. So it's Lauren McLaughlin with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. And so we are a research organization obviously founded by Parkinson's patients themselves, but really figuring out how to engage patients in order to drive meaningful clinical outcomes and clinical research is something that the foundation is deeply rooted in. We try to drive very innovative, very novel research in order to push the entire field forward. We also develop a lot of research tools that can then be utilized across the entire field so that we're not constantly having to start off at square one, so that we can then kind of move forward at a more rapid pace in order to get therapies to our patients as quickly as possible. Specifically in my role, I am on the research partnerships team, and so I have the great honor of working with a number of people kind of on the panel, as well as in the audience here, on doing really fun, innovative, novel relationships and partnerships across multiple different functions, whether they're a research team, industry, patients themselves, in order to define what is important to the patient and making sure that that voice is represented and recognized in research so that we can define those endpoints in order to drive the research, make the data available to make better research decisions and funding decisions moving forward.
And did you answer the question why patient input matters? Yes, why?
Because patients are at the source of everything that we do.
Okay, good. I'm going to hold you.
So yeah,
be honest
they are both the start and also the end of everything that we do.
Well, speaking of patients,
Exactly.
we're lucky to have Margaret here. Margaret, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Margaret Sheehan. I'm on the Michael J. Fox Foundation Patient Council. It's a council of about 30 members, all of whom have Parkinson's, and we're from all across the country, all different professional backgrounds, but we all gather twice a year to help inform what the Michael J. Fox Foundation is focusing on and how they're making decisions and how they react to things that are going on in the medical community and in the legislative world and just in the public at large. And it's been an incredibly rewarding experience. That was my first, this has been my first involvement in patient participation. It was indirect through a foundation, but it's been incredibly meaningful and incredibly, it just, it feels good to be able to do something about the disease that you have.
Kara?
Good afternoon. My name is Kara Haas. I'm with Johnson & Johnson in our Regulatory Affairs Policy and Intelligence Group for our medical device sector. As all of you probably know, Johnson & Johnson is a large medical device, medical industry partner who we've got about 150,000 employees worldwide, and I'm just going to say the reason that...
Why did patient input matter?
Why does patient input matter? I'm going to just echo what Lauren says, because patients are at the center of everything. Our core tenet of our credo, our document that drives what we do is patients comes first. It's patient-centric. And so driving patients' outcomes is not just all about who's delivering the care, but it's also what the patients need and want. And so that's a holistic view we have with regards to patient safety, with product development, ensuring that patients are providing input into all stages of our development. My role is specifically related to outcomes and evidence and implementing these types of changes and policies and opportunities and methodologies into our medical device sector. But across Johnson & Johnson, we have a very active group that is focused on patient engagement.
Great, thanks. Chad?
Thanks. So Chad Mather, I'm a faculty member both in the Department of Orthopedic Surgery and the Duke Clinical Research Institute. So I'm a busy practicing orthopedic surgeon and then a busy research practice as well. And You know, I'm fortunate to work with Reed Johnson, who helped a lot with the obesity study, and some really experienced Cadillac, Rolls-Royce, DCE researchers, and that's a lot of what we do in our preference evaluation research group at the DCRI. But you know, my answer to why patient input matters is comes from a lot of my original interest, academic interest, is in value-based care, and I think without a doubt, aligning care along patient preferences is a strategy to achieve that. And so we talk a lot about, or I talk about this preference efficiency gap, where there's certainly lost utility and excess costs from providing treatments that are probably inconsistent with their preferences because we don't measure them. And then as well, we also see that it's not just excessive care. There's also a lack of care in situations where, again, what we've talked about today, where they're willing to accept those risks, and we would prefer that.
Great, thanks. Sandra?
Hello, I'm Sandy Statz. I run our clinical and regulatory functions for Exact Sciences. Exact Sciences is a reasonably small company. We're a molecular diagnostic company with a focus on screening and early detection of cancers. And from my perspective, patient preference is really important in this space because there's a differential between what doctors might want in terms of understanding an individual's health condition versus what a patient might want or might tolerate. And I think particularly when you look at colorectal cancer in the screening paradigm there, we have an excellent choice in colonoscopy, and yet 30% of the population will not do that test for whatever reason. And so we came up with a molecular diagnostic test that also has patient preference components to it. It's a stool-based test. People have to handle it. And understanding what their tolerances are for taking the test, it as an option and how it performs relative to colonoscopy was important to understand whether or not there was a marketable product there. So similar to what Kara said, in terms of using and understanding patient preference all the way from understanding, do you have a product and what type of outcome do you need from that product? What are you targeting in terms of its performance is critically important in the diagnostic space.
Annie, why do patients matter?
Patients are at the heart of what we do. Our CDRH vision is that patients in the U.S., it starts with patients. Patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe, and effective medical devices, first in the world. Not that it's a competition, as Jeff says, but.
I wanted to point out that I didn't answer the question because I have a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And really, people like Margaret, that's why we do what we do, and she and the Fox Foundation partnership and all that work has been just fantastic, and it just reminds us all of why we're doing what we're doing.
So if patients matter so much, then why this sudden recent phenomenon? Why are we suddenly now interested in gathering? Why is this a new initiative for the medical device industry? I'm going to ask Margaret to answer that question. What do you think?
Well,
from a patient's perspective, what you're looking maybe from the outside in, why do you think we as a medical device community maybe only recently discovered this phenomenon?
Because it used to be hard, and now it's getting easy. I think the internet and connectivity and big data and analytics and you know, all the ways you can gather, store, and analyze information has made it almost, you know, kind of you'd have to not be paying attention to not think that you could do this now. And if you can do it, you should do it, because a patient is no different than any other consumer. If you work for Kellogg, you do focus groups to figure out what kind of cereal to sell. If you work for Mattel, you have kids in a room bouncing balls and playing with Barbies. And patients are no different, but it used to be hard to get patient information. And it just, I think there's no compelling, patients aren't sicker, they aren't more needy, they're just more accessible. And that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Annie, from your perspective, what do you think? Has anything changed recently? Do you think it's because information is easier to get access to?
I think it's just the larger sort of shift of the healthcare ecosystem that we've seen, that the role of the patient has really evolved over time from being much more paternalistic to really where we are now, where it is truly much more of a patient partnership. And we're also leveraging science that had, behavioral economics isn't new. This stuff isn't new. It's just a matter of the context and using it in this, in a benefit risk or in a regulatory decision-making type of context. So, and that's also why I came up earlier in terms of capacity building, that we've got to do more to be able to grow the field, to be able to do more of this, because it's really critical.
I thought you were going to say it was the leadership of Jeff Sheehan, but
It's the leadership of Jeff Sheehan.
that was a softball for you there. Sorry. All right, Chad. What about your perspective? Why do you think, as a physician, from your work, why do you think the medical devices have suddenly woken up to the idea of asking a patient what matters to them?
Well, I think in many ways it's an evolution. You can't study everything at one time, and as we've evolved in our methods and delivery systems, it becomes a natural way to look at things. And that's certainly been in my own evolution is that way. I used to do a lot of decision modeling, and we'd look at these models and the simulations, and the objective originally was to decide which A or B was better. And what I'd realized is that it was about 50-50 most of the time, or even though 51-49, and we could declare a more cost-effective or preferred strategy. But the real preferred strategy was to align those treatments with the right patient, and getting their input is the core part of that.
Sandy, I think you kind of answered this question actually by saying that it mattered from a marketing perspective to determine whether or not you had a market, right? I mean, you were at a stage in the development of your product where you needed that information to actually make a go, no-go decision, maybe internally as a business or to convince regulators the same way. But Kara, what about your perspective from Johnson & Johnson and all the experience you've got in this area?
So philosophically, from Johnson & Johnson's perspective, it's the only way for us to be patient-centric and understand what the patients need. We've made a significant investment externally and internally to evolve with, or hopefully at times ahead of the general pack of where things are going. But I want to echo what Margaret said and then go back to what Annie said. If you think about the evolution of just the healthcare environment, patients having access to information, then they go to their physician, and then that shared decision making now is with a more informed patient. The patient may say, well, in column A, I want that one, but column B, I want that, so where's my benefit risk? And then you think about it and say, well, gee, we've been doing consumer research. Why are we not engaging patients throughout the total product life cycle? That benefits the patient. It benefits the company from a perspective of bringing to market products that both meet the clinical need and the patients are interested in using. And then that gets us to the holy grail, if you will, is hopefully with products that patients prefer, you will have better population health.
Right. So we had a list of, all right, I don't know if you guys ever done one of these panel things, but generally in advance, you talk amongst yourselves and you think, okay, what am I going to ask since I don't totally surprise them? That question, actually, we had not rehearsed that one. So that was a little unfair. That was, I kind of took you off.
We know you well enough to not expect that you're actually going to give us this question.
Okay, so I'll go back to a couple of the scripted questions here. Okay, so Margaret, curious about your journey. Why was it that you got interested in getting involved in clinical research as a patient, and not just in the research itself, but also in the overall research kind of structure?
Well, probably because, I should back up. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2004, and then 2014 was a very eventful year for me. In January of 2014, I underwent a deep brain stimulation surgery, which is, now here and here. Oops, sorry. And it's always fun to go through the metal detector at the airport. And so I was a consumer of a medical device. And then in July of that same year, I got diagnosed with breast cancer. And I went through chemo and radiation and got a breast implant. So I had 2 medical devices in my body. I'm a cyborg and proud of it.
Twofer.
Yes. What I call my double-decker shit sandwich. But
delay on this?
write that down. But seriously, in 2010, before any of this all happened, except for the Parkinson's diagnosis, the Michael J. Fox Foundation reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to join the patient council. And I kind of thought, you know, I don't want to join an organization that has a patient council so that they can say they have a patient council. I want to join a group that actually has an impact. And I have to be honest, I mean, it has really evolved over the last 7 years to be something where we've been, you know, leaning more towards the former and now very much, you know, I would say very relevant and very significantly involved in what the foundation does. And what happened to me is that Annie and Heather and Todd and some other people came up to the foundation patient council meeting, and they talked about this patient preference study they were doing. And it was so exciting because it was a way that, you know, people, a select group of us, well, we weren't select, we selected ourselves. But you know, a group of us, a small group of us, could be involved at the outset in not only designing, you know, taking the survey that was going to be developed, but helping to design the survey and to describe what needed to be asked and how it needed to be asked and what needed to be measured. We are not experts in much on this committee, but we are experts in having this disease. And it was a really eye-opening experience that, you know, they're really smart people, but they don't know. How can they know what it's like to have Parkinson's? So, you know, just basic stuff like, you know, is this a side effect or a symptom? Is, you know, something that we could answer, and it was incredibly helpful, I believe, to the design of this survey that we're going to launch in a few weeks. So I really got excited, frankly, because of the presentation and the great job that the FDA and MDIC and RTI gave us in spring of 2016. Yeah.
So, Lauren, is there something that's changed recently that's gotten either the foundation itself or maybe the patient advocacy community more engaged or more interested in this type of work in the science of patient input?
I mean, I think patient advocacy groups have always been engaged, obviously, and I think it's just because of everything that everyone said on the panel, because we're all here in this room today, there's finally an audience to listen to those things in order to take the science of patient input and really figure out how to turn those qualitative stories and those voices into quantitative data that can resonate alongside so many of the other kind of research objectives, the payer objectives, the total product life cycle objectives, is a really invigorating opportunity in order to figure out how do we take all of this information that Margaret was speaking about that's out there, not only for the research community to understand what's going on, but also for patients themselves to arm themselves with the knowledge, to arm themselves with their options, as well as to educate themselves on how to speak out in a way that will resonate with the various audiences that need to listen. I think that funnel of information, that two-way street is finally coming together in order to have a productive dialogue, to really allow everyone to have an equal seat at the table. And just kind of working on the specific survey that Margaret was mentioning, as well as Annie and MDIC has helped spearhead, everyone is really just, they're not talking the talk, they're actually walking the walk. And seeing that action and excitement from every single level is so encouraging that it makes us want to work even harder and keep going forward.
Sounds really exciting. I wonder, Chad, have you run into any super engaged patients as a result of maybe some of these types of activities in your practice?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and I was going to comment, about the qualitative aspect of it. And so, at the research institution, we want to do everything objective, quantitative, and such. But my favorite part of what we do is the qualitative interviews, And it's fascinating, and we never spend that kind of time with patients. We never ask them those kind of questions, like, do you understand that, how that's worded? Do you understand those trade-offs? And what are you thinking right now? And we never ask them that in a traditional encounter. And so I have loved that part of the work and been very fascinated with it. So I could definitely agree that there's a lot of value in that.
So I forgot to tell all of you, because you weren't on the prep call, that you actually have a role here. I don't know if anybody told you, but I have this theory that these panels get really boring after 30 minutes, or maybe it's just my own ADD. And so one way to stay engaged and keep you guys awake is to put a little bit of pressure on you. So you have to be thinking about any questions that you want to ask the panelists here, because as you can see right now, I'm not the best facilitator. I'm sure you can do a much better job. Yes. So I'm going to go to the next question. Sandra, or Sandy, sorry. So, and I think when people think about patient preference information or the patient's perspective, it tends to have started out in the higher risk devices or the implantable type of devices. Partially, I don't know why, but that the IVD space is one that's kind of like, really, I'm not really sure why. Why would that make a difference? It sounds like your company's story is a pretty logical one, but from your perspective in your sector within the industry, do you think there are more opportunities in vitro diagnostics, or is it maybe a little bit more challenging because you don't have maybe a lifelong connection with the patient after an implant?
I actually think there's a lot of room for patient information in the diagnostics arena. If you think about it, almost every medical decision that gets made has a test behind it, and there's no perfect test. So we presume often when we have these tests done that it's definitive, and it can be a really good test, but every test is flawed. And sometimes we make choices about tests, about whether or not they're safe or effective based on those flaws. How well do they work? How often do they give you the correct result? How often do they tell you the wrong result when you really don't have something? But depending upon the condition, a patient might really have a real insight into how important is that differential. So I'm going to go back to our company's example. It's a screening test for colorectal cancer. I don't know the answer to this, but this is the question I would like to ask. Do patients who choose a molecular test over a colonoscopy care about whether or not the test is super good at detecting precancer or polyps? How much do they care about that versus whether or not disease is present? Colorectal cancer has a very long timeline to develop into disease. So if you have polyps, you become higher risk for development, but it's not a for sure thing. So in our case, we have a test that's very good at detecting cancer and better than other things at detecting precancerous polyps, but it's not great. There's a balance there. I don't know what the answer is, but people are choosing the test. And I would love to know the answers. Is there a preference there relative to how the test works? And I think you can apply that conceptually across a lot of different types of diagnostics. I think often about treatment decisions and what is the actual performance or performance trade-off you're getting in a particular test when you're going to make a treatment decision, and what's the patient's comfort level with that, and how much do they know about it? How much do they actually understand, and can we not only engage them to understand how they feel about what that outcome will be or what that decision is going to be made based on that test, but also are they willing to accept maybe more space in the understanding depending upon what that condition is and what their options might be.
So Cara, Johnson & Johnson, I think, is probably one of the most unique companies in terms of its portfolio of different kinds of products. You've got pharmaceutical therapies, you've got medical devices, and you also have consumer products. And I've heard rumors about it's such a large organization that maybe sometimes each of the divisions don't always talk to each other. But it sounds like you guys are really doing a really good job in this area, and I wonder what kind of resources is J&J putting behind this?
So J&J is putting a significant amount of resources behind patient centricity from multiple perspectives. There's focus on patient input with regards to product design, patient input with regards to clinical trial enterprise, patient input for patient-centered benefit risk to understand that, as well as a very clear focus on patient safety, and then closing that loop, because what we learn in the post-market space, which we anticipate will be enhanced with NEST and the leveraging of real-world evidence, will allow us to actually leverage all that information to feed back in. But I actually, in my notes, was going to talk about, earlier, we referred to, patient input for the design of a therapeutic option. Then we talked about, shared decision making, but the two places in between that we didn't really talk about as a panel was once there is a product and you want to evaluate it, patient input into clinical trial design, both for recruitment and retention, but also ensure that you have endpoints to ensure that your PROs are actually patient-centric, not just things that are being collected because the patient can only collect them. Or if they're PROs that actually are surrogates for something that's patient-centric, making sure the patients understand that. And then the next piece would be patient-centered benefit risk, being able to ensure that you've had that conversation, you understand what's the trade-off. It's not for every product or every therapy, but what's the trade-off that can occur. And the agency's done a fabulous job of engaging the topic, having great conversations, and being very receptive and open to how we can, as industry, bring these opportunities to them by looking at the spectrum of what patients will accept. We've heard people say, they're bungee jumpers and they're knitters, so providing a wide spectrum of options, but that also then it's incumbent upon the manufacturer industry, the ecosystem, ensure that benefit risk choice, shared decision-making is a well-informed one. So they're all interlaced. So to go back to your original question, what's J&J putting, what's our skin in the game? It's a lot of hands. It's a lot of hands both in our R&D organizations looking at clinical trial enterprise. It's a lot of folks in all of the sectors looking at what patients need and want and what the classic description of what our product development is. Well, let's take patient input and see where they're aligned to the things that we didn't think of. And then as we go through every step of the total product life cycle, there are starting to be questions. A lot of us are spending a significant amount of time and energy making sure we're educating everyone along the way, that the question should always be asked, here's how we did things, where could patient input be incorporated, how could it be incorporated, how should it be incorporated?
So thanks for the plug for the Science Patient Input Steering Committee's projects there. Now you all know why Kara's on the steering committee. So Annie, I've saved probably the most difficult question for you. Does all this stuff really matter? And I know, here, turn the cameras up now. I know it's a public meeting and you are representing the U.S. federal government, but maybe what you could do is answer this a little bit differently. Is there internal skepticism, healthy skepticism within the agency about this kind of information and its value in regulatory decision making?
I think a lot of the questions are probably more scientific or more in terms of how do you actually do it. So it's more process oriented because it is new to a lot of our folks. A lot of our reviewers are biomedical engineers. I'm one, so I can make fun of myself, and clinicians and other things who may not be knowledgeable in the social sciences, so they may not have as much background. So it's a process of working with the team. So as we've been seeing patient preference studies as they have come in, our mantra both internally and externally is, loop me in, loop in Martin Ho, who is taking a well-deserved vacation, and we'll be there and work with the review teams to sort of educate them and say, this is what a preference study is, this is how it works, and kind of work with the team and get them kind of up to speed, because it is something, in a lot of cases it's new, and it sort of reminds me, I've heard Owen say this, and I see him back there, a few years ago with early feasibility, it was sort of a similar situation. The first couple experiences, the teams, are getting up to speed, it's new for them, so there's some, work to do internally to get people to understand it, but I would say overall, there's not antagonism towards it. It's just a matter of trying to kind of just getting a better idea of what to do. And so we're trying to do that, and part of our building capacity is to do that both internally and externally.
Sounds healthy. Sounds human.
Yes.
All right, rapid fire. You're only allowed to answer this question within 15 seconds. I'll be timing you. What do you think is our biggest challenge in the world of patient input into the regulatory process? And you just answered, so I'm going to come back to you. Sandy, you're first.
I think probably just making it routine and understanding how to approach the patients, how to get that feedback relative to your question.
Right, under time. Chad.
Implementation. We've done a lot with shared decision-making tools, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we use them to make the life of both the patient and the provider better so that they'll be useful.
Well done. Kara.
I think that echo everyone to roll it up and just change management of the implementation, the uncertainty that comes along with it, and then having everyone think about why we should be doing things differently.
Everybody went so fast. Margaret, you have a little bit more than 15 seconds.
Okay. No offense to Chad, but I think that the doctors are very smart, and they're very arrogant a lot of times, and they think they know what patients want. So, that the buy-in of the medical community out in the field, I think, is a really critical.
Doctors, lawyers, they're all arrogant.
Yeah.
And then, so ditto for everything, but then also the speed and urgency that we need to figure out how to integrate the patient voice.
Annie, you want to chime in?
Biggest challenge? Capacity.
For you guys.
I would say on both ends. There's only so many Bretts and other preference researchers in the world.
Okay, well, that was the rapid fire round. We have 15 minutes left for this panel, and there's a lot of people in here, so that means there's going to be a lot of questions. So you're going to have to keep these questions short, guys. Calm down. It looks like Kim has a question. Is that right, Kim?
Imagine that. So maybe you could go back to the slide that had the bar graph on it. I was thinking about that as Annie was making a comment, and then Margaret just made her comment about physicians. And yesterday, Faster Cures had a workshop that Lauren and Mimi Nguyen from FDA were in, and we were talking about driving patient insights earlier in the process. And it's interesting to see that it's kind of low in the early stages of medical product development here on this survey. And yesterday at this workshop, there was a major biotech company on the panel, and she said that their gating decisions are generally made by a process where they put, in one case at least that she had as an example, 23 physicians around a table. And that was sufficient rigor in their minds to make a decision about whether to go forward with a particular product development. And yet we wrestle with this idea of what is the science of patient input and how do we do it and what are the numbers we need and the representativeness. And we haven't really done that with other types of KOL. So I'm just wondering how can we square that and not hold ourselves to some impossible standard as we've done in some other kind of emerging areas of science, so that we don't have stumbling blocks on our way to getting to what might be the ultimate state of patient input, but that we have some ability to kind of experiment and learn and use smaller numbers of people to help us get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say that little goes a long way, and that it doesn't have to be perfect in order to be very useful and have a lot of impact. And I know some of my collaborators, we've realized as we've done more of this work that the methodology really isn't defined, and that would take a decade or a career to fully define that. And certainly we have to be willing to accept that there will be error. But that because we have started from a place where there's no input, that any input is extremely valuable.
Again, it sort of really depends on the context of the use. So if you're at your development stage, you probably don't need a full-blown quantitative patient preference study. Bringing in some patients as KOLs, just like you would physicians, would probably be a sufficient type of patient input. You wouldn't. So it's really depending on the context of what you would want to do. When we're making a benefit risk assessment and we're looking at valid scientific evidence, that is certainly why we would look more towards a quantitative study for that type of decision making. So it's really, I would say, a function of what it is that you're trying to do and what is the question or what are you trying to get to.
Another question?
Yeah, hi. My name is Cisco Vicente. I'm with the Office of Compliance at CDRH. The patient focus has allowed us in CDRH to really, recenter ourselves and really rethink about how we are doing things and approaching things. I'm curious because I see a lot of the engagement and a lot of the effort happening up in the development side. One of the challenges I think I see as a regulatory agency is what happens on the post-market space. So I'm curious, how do we do that? How do we close that loop, right? What's the role for that patient engagement piece in that post-market kind of, we now have to jump into action phase?
Lauren, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I was going to kind of default it to the NEST team, but I think that working with the payers, figuring out how to get the now approved therapies into the hands of the patients that much faster is a key roadblock, whether it's from truly just the reimbursement perspective, whether it's through an education of the clinical staff that can then recommend those therapies, whether it's figuring out kind of word of mouth on the patient side, what options are out there. I think so frequently I hear from patients that they are the ones that raise these new topics to their clinicians. And so figuring out how do we kind of figure out how to quantify that? How do we figure out how to bring that back into that entire process to prove that there is a need, that market research exists, that there is a market for those types of therapies and devices.
I think there are a couple of different examples. One last week for the home dialysis with regards to patient input. The other piece, there's a population that currently does not have access, and there's feedback, or they give feedback about their benefit risk preference. Also, the benefit risk may turn out to be different when it's in the post-market space. For example, the other example Annie gave about how do we had to make a product change to deal with a benefit risk perspective. The other thing in the payment arena is, again, I'll go back to the hypothetically, if you have therapies that your optimal therapy, and then you have based on patient preference an alternate therapy that maybe not be optimal to the clinician or medically, and in due disclosure, I'm a clinician, so I can throw some stones, is a surgeon clinician, so I can throw a lot of stones, is that if you have patients who are making the binary decision, I won't have therapy because I won't accept that, and then there are other patients who would accept this, you would actually end up with better overall health, and I would think the payer community would be interested in that. We just have to find the right pilots and the right metrics and the right disease states to model that in.
Certainly, NEST could have some potential for that as well in terms of, and potential area for, and it's been discussed personally with the Science of Patient Input Group, and also came up earlier this morning about how we link those pieces together to understand the patient perspective throughout the entire product life cycle.
Hi, Heather Colvin from Johnson & Johnson, and I was just thinking about Margaret's earlier comments about the availability of data and being key, and thinking about the new innovative ways that we can get access to patient-generated data directly. And it's actually Kim's question that spurred on my question to you all, which is how do we start leveraging the data that patients are already generating in different types of patient platforms and patient registries and in patient communities to start informing some of the early stage development and input. I think that that's a great resource, and I don't know what the priorities might be, but I'd love to get your thoughts about where we should be using this data and how we should use it.
Chad, do you or Duke have any experience in this area?
I'm sure Duke does. I don't personally, but I mean, it's probably an extension of the same market research techniques that we started all the DCs and conjoint with is understanding what how to access those communities and how they would use it for other research.
I think that's something we definitely would like to explore further, is how can we use data that's already collected, that patients have already inputted. Certainly it's the work we're doing with the one of the mHealth projects, which apparently is one of the NEST demonstration projects, could lead towards some of that.
What about the
So I think some of it is around informed consent, as well as data sharing, understanding that it is kind of a patient's own information, their own data, their own health information that they would be willing to share, but then figuring out what are the appropriate platforms in order to get those out there at mass quantity, in order to figure out and elicit any trends in that information. It's a problem, but I think that we can definitely tackle it because the patients are willing to speak. They're willing to share their experience. And Margaret, I don't know if you have anything to share just from your own personal experience that might be able to resonate for the larger audience.
Well, I think that patients are generally in favor of anything that has the ability, the capacity, increases the odds of moving things forward. So if you can develop a very efficient but effective informed consent process, as well as, this is the lawyer in me coming out, agreements among the various platforms, you know, the sponsors of those platforms on how they're going to share the data and how they're not going to share the data and how it's going to be stored and how it's going to be kept safe. I think, so at the bottom with the patient, I shouldn't say the bottom. Why are the patients at the bottom? You know, the patient level, the informed consent process has to be well thought out. And then at the entity level, you have to have very, very rigorous agreement around issues about gathering the data, sharing the data, storing the data, and analyzing the data.
You know, one other topic that came up in conversation today was also lack of understanding by the institutions or the clinicians about using patient data and how we might actually need, we, meaning the royal we of an ecosystem, need to actually educate the clinical investigators and the institutions about the difference between a clinical trial and leveraging patient-generated or patient information, and then how to deal with the consent issues and interface with all the different real-world evidence, real-world data, patient-generated data, because there's a spectrum and there appears to be a gap in the knowledge and understanding at the organizational level, and that, you know, folks being told they need to have a clinical trial in IRB to be able to do that. So I think there's an opportunity there as well for education.
Great, thanks.
Nadim Yared, CDRH. Very informative panel and a very important topic. Thank you, folks. Quick question here. Every patient preference testing costs multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars these days. And from our perspective, we need to be skating to where the puck is going to be. So we'd like to do preference patient testing trending and see how it's evolving over time. So when we develop a product 5 to 10 years from now, we know where that will head. Should MDIC be involved in not only developing the science behind how do we use the patient data, the patient preference data, but also developing the tools to collect this data in a much more cost-effective way? Thank you.
A great question, and I think it goes a little bit to some of the things that we are discussing in the Science for Patient Input Steering Committee about when do you use what kind of method. There are some, as Annie mentioned, some tools that have been developed that are very cost-effective. I mean, I wouldn't say cheap, but you know, depending upon the resources and the access to the patient community, it could be virtually free. That could essentially help inform regulatory decision-making. But I think you're right, and we're at Edwards working on several different patient perspective studies, and the range of cost, depending upon the type of methodology that is used, can get up into the several $100 million range. A lot of that has to do with access to a patient community. We're finding it's a big challenge, but it's a great point, and I don't know if anybody.
I mean, I think we have gotten better and learned a lot from everything that we've done, each study we've done, and they've got, I think we'll be able to reuse parts of that. You don't have to examine every question as it's new as it is now. For example, we're doing a study with Zimmer now. We're basically looking at the trade-off of revision surgery versus function, and how patients would be willing to accept risks of a new device, or in this case, a unicompartmental knee replacement, which has higher function but a higher revision rate. And so that general type of trade-off could be reused and applied in a lot of different situations. So
I think the more we learn about the different methods and what they can be used for, that could potentially, as moving forward, the different methods may have different costs, and it's really a matter of what type of questions you're trying to answer, and that would obviously also affect the cost.
I would just echo, you know, developing instruments that can be repurposed, re-leveraged for a disease state is going to potentially be one of the more cost-effective ways, whether that be done on a company basis or you have a consortium or collaboration that agrees to develop a single tool.
One last word on
Yeah.
that, sorry.
That's right.
So engage the patients very early on and almost have them at the ready. Don't wait for the tools to then be developed to find the patients to respond, but find a way to have those collaborations, these partnerships with patient advocacy organizations so that you are ready to go when the tools are there.
I'm sorry, we only have time for one more question. It's such a backlog of questions, and I think he was first, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. Mac McKean, Boston Scientific.
Yeah.
And mine really is maybe one more of terminology. I've been in this business over 25 years, back in the 90s with the ICDs and the 6-minute hall walk. In fact, Dr. Mather and I talked a bit about that. But is it really about, because I'm not hearing in the guidance or in the discussion, quality of life. And I think each of the stakeholders here in the panel would have their version of that, especially the patient, right? And in your case, you get this therapy. And it's not the matter of life or death, right? We get that, right? A defibrillator saves lives and things of that nature. But this is like when you get a product, what is the quality of life measure? And perhaps that's the PRO. So it might be a more technical term for it. But I just think that that's kind of my general observation is what happened to quality of life as sort of an outcome.
Well, I think that's also where you can make the distinction between preferences and PROs. So patient preferences can help you figure out what trade-offs or what types of trade-offs, say, people are willing to take in terms of, quality of life versus mortality types of things in terms of those trade-offs, whereas the patient-reported outcome would be the quality of life, and we would consider quality of life types of measures as patient-reported outcomes.
And I think this is just a deeper dive into that quality of life, understanding what components drive that and how that's different for different individuals, how we use that to direct their care and communicate with them.
Yeah, one of the studies that we're looking at is looking at various PROs that measure quality of life or different aspects of quality of life and which of those are most important to the patient. So that's, I think, part of where the nuance comes into play. And
patient preferences can inform patient-reported outcomes so that you have a much more patient-centric patient-reported outcome.
Right.
Because everyone who's heard me speak for more than 2 minutes have heard me say that all PROs are not patient-centric, and we have to remember that.
Yeah.
All right, any parting shots before we turn it back to Stephanie?
I'll just make one comment that we get this question a lot in terms of process. So if you're interested in doing a patient preference study, we suggest you come talk to us early and you can go through the pre-submission process.
Pre-submission, all right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, short break, 15 minutes, reconvene at 2:30.